interesting connection with Professor Benjamin. I am a New Paltz grad, didn't study political science there, but spent time there long enough to come away with a baccalaureate degree. And then Professor Benjamin had my oldest son in one of his classes, I think on state government. I think it was New York State government. And so we have kind of a connection. And of course, I have been covered in some of my activities in redistricting, actually, by his daughter. So, you know, it's kind of a strange help.
They're real big.
Redistricting is, of course, involved with many complex issues, but principally it involves, in modern times, from Baker versus Carr, Reynolds versus Sims, U.S. Supreme Court cases that really require legislative bodies of any sort, town, city, county, village, whatever, if you have district representation, that the districts of representation be approximately equal in size by population, so that one voter is not denied the opportunity to elect a person of equal weight with everyone else. And in New York, of course, we had malapportionment up until that time, and I think the case is Lomenzo versus New York Times versus Lomenzo. Lomenzo was the Secretary of State at the time when New York's maldistricting was challenged, and we entered the modern era with a redistricting enforced by, I think, by the court in '65, and then in '70, the decennial census, the first population-driven redistricting was undertaken by the state, and in reality, the plan that we currently operate under is very similar to that first plan that was done in 1970, and that plan was driven by a legislature controlled in both houses by the Republican Party and by a Republican governor. And so, bringing it up to date, I do have a participation that's over a long period of time. I was very much involved in redistricting of the Chautauqua County Legislature at least twice, probably 3 times. And so I cut my teeth at a smaller district level, 25-seat legislature, and then 10 years ago, or 9 years ago, I was appointed as co-chair of the Legislative Task Force on Redistricting. It's got a bigger title than that, it's kind of a mouthful, and I can't remember what it is, but what we did basically was redistricting. Oh, I know, it's misnamed, it's apportionment, I think, apportionment. Well, we don't do apportionment. There's a federal law that has a formula in it that's very strange, that apportions the seats in Congress according to the populations of the states. The law, by the way, disadvantages New York State. We should lobby our federal representatives to get that law changed so that we're not disadvantaged in the future in congressional apportionment. But obviously, there's not an equally divided number of seats. What do we say? When you divide 435 into whatever the population, it doesn't come out equal. So somebody has a remainder, and the remainder gets thrown to California, as I remember. But at any rate, we do reapportionment. Now, I will point out that I favor the legislative approach. I say that really unabashedly. I think the principal objection to that, the one that we are most vulnerable on, is that in fact is self-interest. Not much way to deny that. We have great interest in districting. But beyond that, I would say to you that I don't think that there is any other individual in the 150 assembly seats that is more in tune or more knowledgeable about the communities that they represent than these 150 members who are elected. And when you come down to the actual drawing of district lines, although there's, to be sure, an opportunity for partisan advantage, the real concern is whether or not the community of interest is adequately represented and people have the opportunity to be in a district where they feel comfortable that they in fact are a community of interest and can elect a representative of their choosing. Now, there are people in the political science world who tell you, or would posit the argument, that if you have equally divided districts, between partisan parties, say Republican and Democrat, you're going to have nearly 50% of the voters unhappy all of the time because they're going to be losers. And they're going to vote for a candidate who has lost. Of course, the winners will be happy at least for a couple of weeks. They seem to be, they lose the momentum going forward. I mean, Obama was very popular before he actually took the oath of office, and people were excited about it, so the winners were feeling good. But I think even after elections, the winners start to second guess themselves. But for sure, the 50% of the district that are losers are going to be unhappy. Now, if you had equally divided districts maximized in New York State, which would be very difficult to do, but if you could do it, you'd debate, in fact, have 50% of all the people in New York unhappy. So there are political scientists that argue that a better solution would be to pack the districts so that 80% of the people were of one party and only 20% the other. That way, you reduce the number of unhappy people with the outcome. And so, and why would that be important? That would mean that 80% of the people, at least for a period of time, would feel like winners and feel like supporting the government that they had participated in electing. Now, you're only going to, you have 20% of the people out there that are grumblers. But 80% of the people say, yeah, my rep is someone that, I voted for, and I voted for him because, I voted for her because of these various reasons. Now, I don't particularly subscribe to that notion. I don't think that we should be greatly concerned about the partisan divisions as much as we should be about the communities of interest. And I can tell you from my personal experience in drawing the legislative districts, we were very concerned about communities of interest. And there are some very, what I would call non-uniform districts in the sense that they have legs and squiggles and whatnot. Some of that is driven by community of interest. Some of it is driven by the matrix of laws and the court cases, the Constitution, and whatnot that we work under. And let me just say, the review done by Professor Benjamin was a good one. You have both houses of the legislature that can be both Democrat, both Republican, one of each, which we had for many years. And of course, the governor is always the governor of one of the other parties. For a long time, the Republicans in New York State had the Senate and the governor, in that case, George Pataki. When I did redistricting, the Republicans really had the upper hand in redistricting because they had the governor. The governor had to sign the bill that we passed. One of the endeavors that we had in the assembly, telling tales out of school, was to have enough votes to override a potential veto that Governor Pataki might exercise. And I can tell you that the bill passed the assembly by, I think, 123 votes. I forget how many nays there were, but there were 123 yes votes, which sent a clear message to George Pataki that even if he vetoed the Assembly plan and the Senate plan, which were in the same bill, the Assembly was sure to override it. I don't know what the Senate tried to do, because it was accurately described by Professor Benjamin that we pretty much took the position of the Senate, you draw your lines, the Assembly will draw our lines. They have to be in the same bill under our state constitution, and then they have to be enacted into law and signed by the governor. So that's how we did it. If both houses were controlled by the same party as they were in 1970, I don't know what kind of accommodations would be made between the parties. I suspect, knowing the history of that era and having worked in state government that long ago, believe it or not, that process was driven by Nelson Rockefeller. He was a very powerful governor, a powerful personality, and I doubt very much that he just said, well, you guys go ahead and settle this and let me know what you figured out. I just suspect that Nelson Rockefeller was very involved in it. Now, you might say they drew a partisan gerrymander, and if you were to conclude that, then you'd scratch your head and wonder, well, how did the Democrats take control of the Assembly with a Republican plan? Well, of course, what happened partly was Watergate, which turned off a lot of Republican voters in '74, and a lot of Democrats were elected to legislative bodies. But I think it was also the case that the Republicans, even though they had both houses of the legislature and the governor, they were put in a position of not being able really to gerrymander the Democrats out because too many Democrats. Now this gets to the heart of, can you in fact create these quote-unquote competitive districts in a bipartisan system, two-party system? I got to be about 4 or 5 parties now. I'm not even sure how many we have qualified for the ballot anymore. But predominantly a two-party system. And the answer is no, you can't. If you go to central Brooklyn, you cannot draw a Republican district. There is no way. You can't put 126,000 people together in an assembly district and come up with more than half of them being Republicans. There's not that many Republicans in Brooklyn. Same goes for Allegheny and Steuben County. You cannot draw a Democratic district in Allegheny and Steuben County. I don't care how imaginative you are. The thing might look like we can get done. There are not that many Democrats that live there. And Professor Benjamin did say I was a rare Democrat. I'll tell you how rare I was. First 15, 18 years that I drove down here, I come from further away than anybody. I'd be in Pennsylvania if I were another 18 miles south. I'm closer really to Cleveland than I am to Binghamton. All right? I can drive to Wrigley Field at the same time it takes me to drive to Shea. I guess Shea's down now, but I'm 7.5 miles out of Chicago, 7.5 hours out of Chicago. So I'm a long way up there. I used to get in my car, drive in here on Monday mornings, and I would come the entire route and never cross another assembly district represented by a Democrat. I now have Donald Pardo in Binghamton, in Vestal, and Union Township. She has a city in those 2 townships. And so I cross Beefy through safe Democratic territory. Safe passage after dark. But that's how rare I was. Now, and in a sense, we're getting rarer. Watergate elected, as I recall, 13 Democrats west of the Genesee River. Today, there's only 8 of us. And this gets to some of the comments that Dr. Benjamin made, that we're becoming very much a New York City-centric state, and the party itself is New York City-centric, the Democratic Party, and the predominance is larger and larger. When the Democrats won in '75, I think they had 82 votes, 13 of them west of the Genesee. Well, if you're going to put together a majority to get 76, you know where you had to go to get the votes. You had to go west of the Genesee River. You had to go to the Republicans. So there was great accommodation to those 13 people west of the Genesee because they were part of that minority or majority that wanted to get some things done. Now there are, I think it's 110. I lose track because a couple of people have changed parties.
Special election.
But I think we have 110. 83 of those members reside south of the Tappan Zee Bridge. It won't take 76 votes to pass a bill in the Assembly. So you can see they don't really need those 8 of us out there in God's country too often, unless it's something like voting for the MTA bailout or something, which is always hazardous to my political health, but more hazardous to the people in the MTA region, apparently. But to get back to the redistricting process, one of the things that I did want to add that I didn't hear Dr. Benjamin mention, he may have mentioned before I came in, is that we're also under the direct tutelage, control, sanction, guidance of the U.S. Justice Department. And to assume that they're nonpartisan is to not know much about the U.S. Justice Department. The Attorney General, of course, is appointed by the President and always shares the President's views. And sometimes it's been the campaign manager for the President. The case of Brownell, I think, and Kennedy. Meese was very, So, at any rate, because we are what they call covered by having 2 counties in New York City that are covered counties, the entire state plan has to be approved by Justice before it can become law. And that creates some very interesting dynamics. During the 1990 redistricting, for instance, the Bush administration was very interested in seeing a seat created that would be a minority-majority seat in Upper Manhattan, Washington Heights area. And today that area is represented by Adriana Huspiat, who by birth Dominican. But the Bush administration was very interested to see that seat be created. And they did create it, but they didn't put enough Hispanic people in it to carry a majority. A guy named Brian, forgot his name, nice guy, I remember him well, but can't remember his name. Murtaugh. Yeah, Murtaugh. He carried the district again after the redistricting, but then he finally was beat. But why does justice weigh in? Well, partly because they're partisan, but partly because they have a responsibility to enforce the Voting Rights Act of '64 and its many amendments. And in that, basically, you are compelled by federal law to create minority-majority districts if they meet what is called the Jingles test, which is a court case handed down by the U.S. Supreme Court that says that if a minority is sufficiently large, sufficiently compact to form a district, and they vote routinely to support a candidate or choice and are frustrated by their neighbors in achieving that choice, then you must create them a district. Once created, there's other case law that says you may not retrogress. You can't back away from it. And so consequently, justice gets very involved in that. And of course, if you don't do it right, the groups that represent minority populations will and have sued over the plan, and sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But in doing the plan, you're a lot more concerned about getting it past justice than creating a gerrymander that would necessarily support one party or the other. And it's, again, very difficult to get people to believe in all this because we have a self-interest. And people say, oh, they don't believe that. Maybe not what's happening. But I can tell you again from my experience that we were concerned about the partisan outcome, but that was a concern that was consumed among a host of other legal and constitutional deals. Now, if Blair's going to show pictures, he's probably going to show pictures of ugly districts. Am I right? Or you
Depends on how you define the word ugly.
Okay. Okay. It's all in the eye of the beholder, of course. Some of the ugliness is caused by constitutional requirements that are in the New York State Constitution, a big portion of which was struck down by Lomenzo. However, the verbiage and language that wasn't struck down is still there. I think it comes from the 1898 Constitution. It basically says that you cannot subdivide a township unless the township is larger than an assembly seat. So if you go to Long Island where they have Brookhaven, I don't know, they have 3 maybe assembly seats in Brookhaven, you can subdivide Brookhaven. You cannot subdivide any towns this side of Ramapo. Now Ramapo is an exception, and it was tested in court, and it's a strange case. Ramapo is not larger than an assembly seat, but it's divided into 3 assembly seats. The judge said, we understand you couldn't otherwise draw a plan and met all the other requirements, so we'll allow you to subdivide Ramapo, which was subdivided, I think, in the 80 redistricting and remains subdivided, but it's the only town not larger than an assembly seat that's carved into parts. However, you can carve cities into as many pieces as you want. Now, that was put in the 1898 Constitution by the Republicans because they thought it would disadvantage the Democrats. The irony is 100 years later, it advantages the Democrats because we can take rural townships, which are predominantly Republican, and attach them to pieces of the city, which are predominantly Democrat, and make hay while the sun shines, right? So it's kind of an odd twist. The other thing that you have to observe in that is that there's a block on border, town on border rule that must be adhered to. And it makes things very, very difficult. Basically what the border rule says is that if you have 2 adjoining districts where a town on the border, or in the cases of cities, blocks on the border, would be sized such that if you move that town or block to the neighboring district, the districts would be more equal in population, then you must do it. Now, this causes enormous problems because you can get to the U.S. Supreme Court mandated deviation of plus or minus 5%, which is acceptable in legislative districting plans. And you have a nice looking map, but you'll have two districts that are combined, and you have a little town here on this side has to go over to this side because of that block on border rule. And when that happens, this district gains people, which affects the next district and the next district. I lost the town of Charlotte, which is in my district, or was in my district, because of the block on border rule. And when Charlotte flipped to the 149th district, I'm the 150th, it caused a ripple effect all the way into the middle part of the Finger Lakes, where you have to keep swapping and swapping until you can get that thing to work. Same thing happens in the city. And so many times, not only the deviation drives you to size them equally in regard to 10% or 5% plus or minus, but then you have to do the block and border town and border rule pursuant to the New York State Constitution. I personally think we should consider taking some of that out. But it does complicate and make the districts strange looking. And again, when you get to these strange looking districts, if you analyze what they're made up of, almost always they're made up of jurisdictions that were drawn in the 1800s. But the Constitution denies you the opportunity to subdivide them. You must keep them intact, and consequently they get rather irregular in look. Now, in congressional redistricting, just let me finish with it. I'm talking too long.
I'll use all my time.
Congressional redistricting, we have taken Karcher versus Dragic, another Supreme Court case out of New Jersey, and used it as our guiding principle. And that basically is that deviation in congressional districts can be no more than one person. And so all of the congressional districts in New York State that are in the current census data deviate in population by only a single individual. Now, why do they deviate by a single individual? Again, when you divide 29 into whatever millions of people are in New York State, they come out with a remainder. And this time, I think it was the remainder was 13. And so 13 districts have an additional person. But the rest of them are at that absolute base based on the Dragic case. But I'll yield to my colleague. I could talk all day about this, but just let me tell you, I don't really think you gain a great deal by competition. And that's heresy, I know. The districts are always competitive, personal-wise, and any district can be won by any member of any party, depending on circumstance. The enrollment overlay can be a curse or a blessing. The worst district for you to be one is 80% of your own party, because then you're going to get a primary. And a primary is a lot more difficult to deal with than a general election in a bipartisan mode. And so you really don't want that 80%. You'd rather have something like 60% and be a fair haired boy and have a lot of second cousins. But when you get to competition, I think, again, you have a lot of people who are unhappy with the result. And secondarily, you have a lot of people who won't run because they don't want to abandon what they're doing for a 2-year term, which may be a 2-year term.
Thank you.